Hello and welcome to Further Explorations, where we explore the finer details of science, the near-death experience, and a little bit of everything else. Today's episode is going to be about an important topic, and that is this: just how many people have an NDE? Of all those people who come close to death, of all those people who are resuscitated, how many have a near-death experience, and why is this important? Well, there are and have been a number of statistics out there from different sources giving numbers as to how many people have had a near-death experience. For example, Sam Parney and colleagues in their paper Near-Death Experiences, Cognitive Function and Psychological Outcomes of Surviving Cardiac Arrest state that around 10% of those who undergo cardiac arrest experience a near-death experience. Of course, the Gallup poll from 1992 states that 5% of the population of the United States have had a near-death experience, while a German survey carried out over 2 decades ago found that around 4% report a near-death experience. And one other Gallup poll showed that around 34% of all adult Americans who at some time in their life were resuscitated have had an NDE. Now, what's interesting about these instances is that in all cases the language used suggests that a certain percentage actually had a near-death experience. So what's happening here is the fact that a certain percentage of people are reporting a near-death experience is being conflated with that amount of people having had a near-death experience. This is definitely an important distinction that needs to be made, because just because a number of individuals report a near-death experience, there's no reason to assume that this is actually representative of everyone who has actually had a near-death experience. Now, it's not necessarily irresponsible on the part of these researchers not to state this, but it is important that it is stated, and it's not to say that they haven't changed their minds or anything of that sort, but again, it's something that we consider to be extremely important. And what's even more important is that we're going to show clear evidence that the near-death experience itself has been forgotten by certain individuals, and that, of course, there's always the issue of near-death experiences having that stigma attached to them, which would prevent individuals from even reporting a near-death experience. So apart from those individuals who don't actually report the near-death experience, again, we're going to show evidence that the experience itself has been forgotten, and that these two issues need to be taken into account when presenting apparent numbers which are representative of the amount of people who have an NDE. First, we're going to give examples of these kinds of assumptions in the literature itself, and then we're going to talk about why it's important to actually show these examples. It's not just bashing, it's important in that it will directly affect later research, and we'll show how. One researcher states, "It seems as if the chance of experiencing an NDE is related to the knowledge of someone else who knows about it, or even better, has experienced it himself." Now, what's interesting about this is that the researcher considers there to be a chance one will experience an NDE. Now, this idea is itself predicated on the notion that only a certain amount of people experience an NDE in general, which is, of course, an assumption. Another example of a similar assumption would be, one researcher stated, "Our most striking finding was that the near-death experiences do not have a physical or medical root. After all, 100% of the patients suffered a shortage of oxygen, 100% were given morphine-like medications, and 100% were victims of severe stress. So these are plainly not the reasons why 18% had near-death experiences and 82% didn't." Now here we see an outright assumption that because 18% of those reported the experience, that 82% simply didn't have it. Of course, again, this is an assumption, and while it isn't baseless, it's certainly hasty in its presentation. Now, one extremely well-known author, PM H. Atwater, expresses a similar kind of assumption when she states that the near-death experience is defined by its well-documented features. Why some people undergo the experience and others do not is not understood. Well, of course, the assumption again is that others do not. And again, it's not necessarily irresponsible on the part of the researcher. It's just, it needs to be stated that it is an assumption. Now, there is clear evidence that if the statistics aren't truly 100%, then that they're certainly off in how they're presented. They're certainly not as low as they're generally presented. In one case, a 15-year-old boy with chronic renal failure presented for an exploratory arthrotomy. He had an intraoperative cardiac arrest. He told his parents after he regained consciousness that, "I have a wonderful secret to tell you. I have been climbing a staircase to heaven." He said that the staircase was dark. However, he had no memory of the experience when he was interviewed after the fact. In another case, we hear that nurses present at the event, the near-death experience, state that he opened his eyes after cardioversion and said, "That was really weird. I was floating above my body and suddenly sucked back into myself." He had no memory, however, of making that statement afterwards. He says, "I was floating above my body and was suddenly sucked back into myself." In one other case reported reported in Penny Sartori's How Understanding NDEs Can Help Us Live More Fully, we hear that on a follow-up visit, 2 days later, the patient had no recollection of being in hell, and Rawlings suggested that this was due to suppression. So the individual had initially reported a more hellish near-death experience, that being an extremely rare event. That near-death experience is negative, and even in those experiences that are negative, they're generally considered to progress through until they become positive experience. The hellish aspect of it is usually the individual in some way confronting his own psyche, his own self, his own demons, but that's for another show. In another case from Sartori, we hear that one patient reported to his visitors that he had seen angels at his bedside while he was unconscious. His condition deteriorated after this and he required further sedation. However, when he recovered a second time, he had no recollection of seeing angels or telling his relatives about them. It seems the sedative drugs given had an amnesic effect. Now, what's interesting here is that, again, we hear the idea that the sedatives used in the hospital on the patient has an amnesic effect. And, of course, it would be interesting it would be very interesting to carry out a study of those who who remember their near-death experience between patients who were and who weren't highly sedated. So that's something that will definitely be encouraged. On screen now there will be 3 cases where we see that the individuals retrospectively realise or state that they have forgotten certain aspects of the near-death experience. They have only vague recollections of it, and but they clearly say that they know that there's more to it. Now, while this isn't direct evidence that an entire near-death experience has been forgotten, surely we can see how if elements of an experience can be forgotten, then we could extend that to say all elements of an experience can be forgotten. And again, the impact that would have on statistics. Now, we certainly don't want to give the impression that the near-death experience is inherently flimsy, inherently hard to remember. It's actually quite the opposite. The near-death experience is generally considered as the most vividly remembered event in the individual's life. And Bruce Grayson has carried out a study showing that the experience isn't embellished or changed in any drastic way at all. In fact, there's been other research showing that the actual memory of a near-death experience matches the characteristics that scientists use in order to determine whether or not a memory is a real or imagined event. On the scale of real or imagined, the near-death experience came up as real. Of course, those researchers have an inherent bias that such a thing couldn't be possible, so they cannot actually conclude that. They cannot actually follow their own research to its conclusion and say that the event was real. But it's an interesting study nonetheless. But again, the main point is to say that whenever we hear statistics regarding how many people have a near-death experience, just keep in mind that what we're really seeing is how many people have reported a near-death experience. And that in reality, many more people simply will not report an experience. According to Penny Sartori, it has been noted that the near-death experience is a phenomenon which is kept private, never told due to the stigma the individual feels they might be the recipient of, fear of being viewed mad to some degree. The NDE is an underreported phenomenon. Out of 15 patients who reported a near-death experience in her work, only 2 volunteered the information. Now that's a huge discrepancy, and without even postulating that the near-death experience itself being forgotten could have an impact on statistics, we can certainly say that this will have an impact on the statistics. And again, it's not something that is stipulated, and it should be stipulated that these are simply the numbers representative of those cases reported. Again, from Kelleher's work, we hear that researcher Kimberly Clark observed that many of her clients feared telling others, especially their doctors, for fear that they would think them crazy. Now, of course, we do live in a society where anything even vaguely outside the comfort zone of our daily lives has the capacity to be considered as crazy. So it isn't necessarily surprising that these experiences are highly underreported. Now, with all this said, it is our assertion that 100% of those individuals who will undergo either a close call with death or die will undergo the same experience. And by the same experience, I don't mean the same experience as each other, although they are strikingly similar in general. I just mean they will all actually undergo that transitory experience, which we call the near-death experience. And this is something that we will continue to collect more research on, because we think it's important in the sense that any research done which is based upon or which is reliant upon numbers of those who have had a near-death experience will be potentially wrong, to put it bluntly, in that those numbers are inherently wrong, as we've shown. And although we're not trying to say that all researchers are so inclined as to miss this aspect of things, we do think it is something that isn't spoken about enough, and something that needs to be certainly kept in mind moving forward. So thank you very much for listening to further explorations. Until next time.